You know, I've lived a long life, and if there's one thing I've learned after all these years of printing newspapers, conducting experiments, building businesses, and yes, even helping to birth a nation, it's this. The distance between ordinary and extraordinary isn't what most people think it is. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's not about having the most talent. It's not about where you were born or who your parents were. The real difference, the thing that truly separates those who achieve greatness from those who spend their whole lives wondering what could have been, is something much simpler, much more fundamental, and honestly, much more available to every single person listening to my voice right now. I want you to imagine two young apprentices. Both are 15 years old. Both start working in the same print shop on the same day. They have the same master, the same tools, the same opportunities. One of them, let's call him John, is naturally gifted. His hands move quickly. He picks up techniques faster than anyone else. The master praises him constantly. The other one, we'll call him Samuel, is average in every way. Nothing about him stands out. He makes mistakes. His hands aren't as quick. But here's what happens over the next 10 years. John, confident in his natural ability, does exactly what's required of him and nothing more. When the workday ends, he goes to the tavern. He spends his earnings on pleasures and comforts. He sleeps late on Sundays. Samuel, on the other hand, stays an extra hour each day, practicing even after his hands ache. He saves every penny he can. Saves every penny he can. Saves every penny, saves every penny, saves every penny. He saves every penny, saves every penny, saves every penny. Where commonizing, he spends his Sundays reading everything he can find about the printing trade, about business, about the world. He asks questions. He studies the mistakes he makes and figures out why he made them. Now, fast forward 10 years. Who do you think owns his own print shop? Who do you think is still working for someone else, wondering why his talent never translated into success? I've seen this pattern repeat itself over and over and over again, not just in print shops, but in every single area of human endeavor. The person with less natural talent but more discipline, more consistency, more willingness to delay gratification, that person wins every single time, every single time. And yet, we live in a world that's absolutely obsessed with talent, with genius, with natural ability, as if these things alone determine our destiny. Let me tell you something that might shock you. They don't. Not even close. I've watched this phenomenon for centuries now. This bizarre worship of natural gifts. We've convinced ourselves that success belongs to the naturally talented, that achievement is reserved for those born with some special spark. It's one of the most damaging lies we tell ourselves. Here's what actually happens in the real world. The naturally talented person walks into a room, and everyone gasps. "Oh, look at her. She's a natural." And you know what that person learns? They learn that success comes easy. They learn that effort is for people who aren't gifted. They learn to fear challenge, because challenge might expose that maybe they're not so special after all. Meanwhile, the person who has to struggle, who has to work for every small victory, who falls down and gets back up and falls down again, that person is building something far more valuable than talent. They're building character. They're building resilience. They're building the unshakable foundation that talent alone can never provide. I've seen this pattern repeat itself thousands of times. The brilliant student who coasts through school without studying, then hits their first real challenge in university and crumbles because they never learned how to struggle. The gifted athlete who dominates youth leagues, then gives up when the competition catches up because they never develop discipline. The naturally charismatic leader who fails the moment circumstances demand actual wisdom instead of charm. You want to know what beats talent? Consistency beats talent. Discipline beats talent. The willingness to look stupid while you learn beats talent. The courage to be mediocre on your way to being good beats talent every single time. Think about the people you actually admire, the ones who've accomplished things that matter. I guarantee you, it's not their natural gifts you admire most. It's what they did with those gifts. It's how they showed up day after day. It's how they handled failure. It's how they grew. And let me tell you something about those rejections. Those closed doors, they weren't random. They were testing something. Not your talent, not your worthiness. They were testing whether you'd keep your own door open when theirs slammed shut. I see you there, wondering if you've got what it takes. Let me ask you something. Do you think the people who made it wondered that too? Of course they did. Every single one of them stood exactly where you're standing. The only difference is they decided the wondering wasn't going to stop them from working. You know what's fascinating? We celebrate the breakthrough moment, the viral video, the big yes. But nobody posts about Tuesday afternoon when they had to rewrite that scene for the 7th time. Nobody throws a party for showing up to the empty workshop, the silent inbox, the project that nobody's asking about yet. That's where it happens, though. That's the real work. See, discipline isn't sexy. It doesn't photograph well. You can't capture it in a before and after post. It's the decision you make when you're tired, when you're discouraged, when the metrics say nobody's watching. It's choosing to be excellent when mediocre would be so much easier and nobody would know the difference. Except you'd know. And that's the thing about mastery. It's not performed for an audience. It's practiced in private. It's the standards you hold when nobody's checking. It's the extra hour you put in not because someone demanded it, but because your craft deserved it. I watched a documentary filmmaker once, spent 3 years on a project, 3 years, and when someone asked if he was worried about the reception, you know what he said? I stopped asking if people would care and started asking if I cared enough. That shift, right there, that's everything. Because here's what happens when you build mastery in the dark. You stop seeking permission. You stop waiting for conditions to be perfect. You stop measuring yourself by applause and start measuring yourself by effort, by growth, by whether today's work was better than yesterday's. You discover that the real gift isn't the attention you've been chasing. It's the person you're becoming in the process of making things that matter to you. There's this moment that happens when you've been creating for a while without the validation you thought you needed. You're sitting there, maybe it's 3 in the morning, and you realize you're not tired. You're not resentful. You're not wondering if anyone will care. You're just present, completely absorbed in the work itself. And you think, when did this happen? When did I stop needing permission to enjoy this? That's when you know you've crossed over. The Greeks had a word for this state times eudaimonia asterisk. It's often translated as happiness, but it's deeper than that. It's the satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with your highest potential. Not performing for others, not collecting trophies, just doing the thing you were meant to do, the way you were meant to do it. And here's what nobody tells you about building this kind of discipline. It makes you dangerous. Not dangerous in a harmful way. Dangerous in that you become impossible to manipulate. You can't be bought with praise. You can't be crushed by criticism. You can't be distracted by trends or derailed by setbacks. You've found something more reliable than external validation, and once you have that, you become unstoppable. I've watched creators ride this shift from desperation to discipline. They stop checking their notifications every 5 minutes. They stop spiraling when something doesn't perform. They stop making decisions based on what will impress people and start making decisions based on what will improve their craft. And paradoxically, maybe you've already guessed this, that's when the external results often start to change. Not because you're trying harder to please people, but because you're finally creating from a place of authenticity instead of anxiety. People can sense that. They're drawn to work that comes from confidence rather than need. But even if the external results don't change, even if you spend years creating in relative obscurity, you're still winning, because you've built something that can't be taken from you. You've learned to generate your own sense of purpose. You've discovered that you don't need the world to applaud to know that your work matters. Then, you have not work matters. You've stepped into what I call the sovereignty of the self-directed life. And let me tell you, that sovereignty changes everything. See, most people spend their entire existence as tenants in someone else's vision. They're renting their sense of worth from employers, from social media platforms, from whoever happens to be watching. And like any tenant, they live in constant fear of eviction. One bad quarter, one algorithm change, one shift in public opinion, and suddenly they're scrambling to find new landlords to validate their existence. But you've become the owner, the architect, the person who builds the structure of their days according to their own blueprint. And here's what nobody tells you about that transition. It's terrifying at first. Because ownership comes with something tenancy never demands: complete responsibility. When you're building in obscurity, there's no one to blame for your choices. No boss who gave you the wrong assignment. No audience that failed to appreciate your genius. No external circumstances that can fully account for where you are. It's just you, your work, and the question that echoes in the quiet: is this enough? I've watched people turn back at this exact threshold. They'll get right to the edge of genuine autonomy, feel that weight of self-determination, and then go sprinting back to the comfort of external validation. They'll take jobs they don't want, chase trends they don't believe in, anything to escape the burden of being the sole author of their own significance. But those who stay, who learn to carry that weight, they discover something extraordinary. They find that the burden transforms. What felt like a crushing responsibility becomes something else entirely. It becomes freedom. The freedom to fail without an audience documenting your collapse. The freedom to experiment without investors demanding immediate returns. The freedom to change direction without having to justify yourself to thousands of followers who signed up for a different version of you. You start making decisions based on a single criterion. Does this move me closer to the person I'm trying to become? Not the person who will get the most likes. Not the person who will make the most money the fastest. The person you actually respect when you're alone with your thoughts. And that's when the magic happens. Because here's what nobody tells you about integrity. It compounds. Just like money in a savings account, except the returns are infinite. Every time you choose the harder right over the easier wrong, you're not just making one good decision. You're building a reputation with yourself. Think about it. When you say you're going to do something and you actually do it, even when no one's watching, even when it's inconvenient, even when you'd rather binge another season of whatever, you're making a deposit into the bank of self-trust. And that account, it pays dividends for the rest of your life. You convicer and defector head by you convicer and marvoro. Indecider and bye-bye. You convicer and defector. I learned this the hard way in my 20s. I had this habit of making grand promises to myself. Tomorrow I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. and change my life. Tomorrow comes, alarm goes off, and suddenly I'm a philosopher. Well, sleep is important for productivity. I'll start Monday. Monday arrives with the same negotiation. Actually, studies show that forcing unnatural wake times can disrupt circadian rhythms. You see what I was doing? I was training myself that my word meant nothing. Not to others, to myself. I became that person who couldn't trust their own commitments. And if you can't trust yourself, how can you possibly expect anyone else to? But integrity isn't just about keeping promises. It's about alignment. It's about making sure that what you believe, what you say, and what you do are all pointing in the same direction. Because when those three things are misaligned, you create friction. And friction creates heat. And eventually, you burn out. I see people all the time living in this constant state of cognitive dissonance. They believe in health but eat garbage. They value family but work 80 hours a week. They preach sustainability, but their entire lifestyle is built on consumption, and they wonder why they feel exhausted, anxious, hollow. The answer is simple. They're living someone else's life. They've outsourced their values to whatever's trending, whatever their peer group approves of, whatever makes them look good on social media, and you can't build a life worth living on borrowed values. I learned this lesson the hard way in my 20s. I spent years chasing what I thought success looked like. The promotions, the salary increases, the impressive job title, and I got there. I climbed the ladder. But when I finally reached that level I'd been striving for, something strange happened. Instead of feeling fulfilled, I felt empty, hollow. Like I'd won a game I never actually wanted to play. Because here's what nobody tells you. You can be wildly successful by society's standards and still feel like a complete failure by your own. You can have everything on paper and nothing in your soul. And that disconnect, that gap between external achievement and internal fulfillment, that's the sound of a life built on someone else's blueprint. The path back to myself started with a simple but terrifying question. If nobody was watching, what would I actually want? Not what would impress people. Not what would make my parents proud or my colleagues jealous, but what would genuinely make me feel alive. For me, that answer led to some radical changes. I left that prestigious job. I moved to a smaller place. I started saying no to opportunities that looked great but felt wrong. And yes, people thought I was crazy. They thought I was throwing away everything I'd worked for. But here's what they didn't understand. I wasn't throwing anything away. I was finally picking up what mattered. This is what authentic living requires. It requires disappointing people. It requires looking foolish sometimes. It requires turning down paths that everyone else is racing down because you've discovered they don't lead where you actually want to go. And I won't lie to you, it's uncomfortable. When you start living according to your own values, you immediately become different. You become the person who doesn't go to every social event. The person who chooses differently. The person who can't be easily categorized or understood. And humans, we don't like different. We like conformity. We like predictability. But here's the trade. You exchange the comfort of fitting in for something infinitely more valuable, the peace of being yourself. And let me be clear about something. This peace isn't passive. It's not sitting quietly in a corner, avoiding conflict. Real self-authenticity is incredibly active. It's making 1,000 small, brave choices every single day. It's speaking up in the meeting when everyone else nods along to a bad idea. It's admitting you don't know something instead of pretending expertise. It's saying, that doesn't align with my values instead of, I'm too busy. It's wearing what makes you feel alive, not what makes you invisible. Seeing also day jams, the ones I'm not a val. The ones day jams about. Day jam, day jams, day jams, day jams, day jam, day jams, day jams, day jam. I learned this the hard way in my 20s. I had this colleague, brilliant guy, genuine visionary, but in every meeting, he'd soften his ideas, round off the edges, make them palatable. He'd present something revolutionary, then immediately walk it back when he saw skeptical faces. Or we could do it the traditional way, he'd add, just throwing ideas out there. One day, after a particularly painful meeting, I asked him why. I don't want to seem arrogant, he said. I don't want people to think I'm difficult. 2 years later, someone else presented his exact idea boldly, unapologetically, and got promoted for it. That's what conformity costs. Not just your peace, but your potential. Because here's what nobody tells you. The world doesn't reward you for being convenient. It might temporarily appreciate your compliance, but it doesn't respect it. People remember the ones who had the courage to be themselves, not the ones who made themselves forgettable. Think about everyone you genuinely admire. Chances are, not one of them got there by perfectly color coordinating with everyone else's expectations. They stood out precisely because they stopped trying to blend in. And yes, there are consequences. Some people won't understand. Some will be uncomfortable. A few might even be hostile. But those reactions, they're not really about you. They're about their own relationship with conformity, with fear, with the parts of themselves they've silenced. The most liberating realization of my entire life was this. I am not responsible for managing other people's discomfort with my authenticity. Let me tell you what happened when I truly internalized this. I stopped shrinking. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped prefacing my opinions with, I'm probably wrong, but I stopped laughing at jokes I found offensive just to keep the peace. I stopped pretending to be less capable, less knowledgeable, less ambitious than I was to make others comfortable. And you know what? Some people didn't like it. Some people actually got angry. I had family members tell me I'd changed, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. I had colleagues who suddenly found me difficult to work with when all I'd done was stop volunteering for everyone's grunt work. I had friends who ghosted me when I stopped being their free therapist, their constant cheerleader, their emotional support system with no reciprocation. Here's the truth that nobody tells you. When you stop being who people want you to be and start being who you actually are, you will lose people. Not everyone, but some. And that loss will hurt. It will feel like rejection. It will make you question whether you're doing the right thing. There will be nights when you lie awake wondering if maybe everyone else is right, and you're the problem. But here's what also happens. The people who stay, they're your people. The ones who show up after you've stopped performing, stopped people-pleasing, stopped contorting yourself into shapes that don't fit you, those are the relationships that actually matter. Those are the connections built on truth instead of convenience, on genuine affection instead of utility. And something else miraculous happens. When you stop living for everyone else's approval, you suddenly have energy you didn't know you possessed. All that energy you were spending on managing perceptions, monitoring your words, suppressing your real reactions, performing the version of yourself that keeps everyone comfortable. That energy comes flooding back to you, and you get to direct it toward things that actually matter to you. I've watched this transformation in person dozens of times. People who are perpetually exhausted, dragging themselves through their days, suddenly become animated when they finally let go of that crushing need to be liked. It's not that life becomes easier. Often it becomes harder in certain ways. But you're no longer fighting a battle on two fronts. You're no longer simultaneously trying to live your life and manage everyone's emotional response to your life. And here's something that might surprise you. When you stop trying to please everyone, the right people actually respect you more. Not less. More. Because there's something deeply attractive about integrity. About someone who knows what they stand for and isn't constantly bending themselves into pretzels to avoid conflict. The people who matter, the ones who are actually good for you, they don't want a performing seal. They want a real human being. The people who get upset when you stop performing? Pay attention to that reaction, because it tells you everything you need to know about why they were in your life. They weren't there for you. They were there for what you did for them, for how you made them feel, for the role you played in their story. When you step out of that role, they're upset because you've disrupted their script. But their script was never your responsibility. I think about this every time someone tells me they're afraid to set boundaries because they might lose people. And my response is, always, you're not losing people. You're just finally seeing clearly who was actually there. The relationship you thought you had, it required your silence, your smallness, your constant accommodation. That's not a relationship. That's a hostage situation with better lighting. And perhaps that's the most insidious part, how they convinced you it was love when it was actually a slow erasure. They didn't use violence or obvious cruelty, they used your own heart against you. They used your capacity for empathy, your willingness to see their side, your beautiful tendency to give people second chances. They weaponized your best qualities. I stayed because I thought leaving meant I had failed. I thought if I could just be more understanding, more patient, more flexible, they would finally see my value. But here's what I didn't understand then. You cannot earn respect from someone who fundamentally doesn't respect you. You cannot logic someone into loving you differently. You cannot perform well enough to make them stop diminishing you. The goalposts will always move. You'll lose the weight they said bothered them, and suddenly it's your career that's too demanding. You'll adjust your career, and suddenly it's your friends who are a bad influence. You'll distance yourself from your friends, and suddenly it's your hobbies that are selfish. There is always something wrong because the problem was never actually the thing they pointed to. The problem was that they needed you smaller to feel bigger. And the truly devastating part? After enough time in this dynamic, you start to police yourself. They don't even have to criticize you anymore because you've internalized their voice. You edit yourself before speaking, you second-guess your instincts. You apologize for taking up space. You've become your own warden. I remember the moment I realized I had stopped laughing. Not just with them, but in general. Laughter requires a kind of freedom, a momentary letting go. And I had been holding my breath for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exhale. When you're constantly monitoring yourself, constantly calculating whether what you're about to say or do will trigger their disapproval, joy becomes impossible. That's what this kind of relationship steals from you, not just your present, but your access to yourself. The you that exists beneath all the accommodation and fear. And here's where we need to talk about something most people don't realize until it's too late. How children internalize this dynamic. If you grew up watching one parent walk on eggshells around the other, you didn't just witness manipulation, you received an education in relationships. You learned what love supposedly looks like. And that education shapes every connection you form afterward. I've spoken with adults who break down when they realize they've been choosing partners who make them anxious, who keep them guessing, who require constant management. And when I ask them to describe their parents' relationship, the pattern becomes immediately clear. They saw their mother or father performing this delicate dance, saw them succeed at keeping the peace through vigilance and accommodation, and their developing brain cataloged that as normal, as what relationships require. The psychological term is learned template, but that sounds too clinical for what actually happens. What happens is you learn that love means anxiety. That caring for someone means monitoring their moods, anticipating their needs, suppressing your own reactions to manage theirs. You learn that your value in a relationship depends on how well you can regulate someone else's emotions while hiding your own. And the cruelest part? This often feels like love to you because it's familiar. When you meet someone who doesn't require this dance, who doesn't need to be managed, who responds to conflict with straightforward communication instead of punishment, you might feel bored, uncomfortable, like something's missing. What's missing is the anxiety you were taught to associate with intimacy. I've watched people sabotage healthy relationships because they felt too easy, while gravitating toward people who recreate that childhood dynamic of never quite being able to relax, never quite knowing if you're doing it right. They're not attracted to drama. They're attracted to the familiar sensation of trying to earn safety through perfect behavior. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. You can tell yourself you've healed, that you've grown, that you understand the patterns now. But then you meet someone who's actually available, someone who texts back consistently, someone who doesn't leave you parsing their every word for hidden meanings, and something in your nervous system starts screaming that this can't be real. The calm feels like the eye of a storm. You're waiting for the other shoe to drop because in your formative years the other shoe always dropped. I've seen this play out in the strangest ways. Someone will finally find a partner who's genuinely kind, who shows up, who follows through on what they say, and within months they're picking fights about nothing. Not because there are actual problems, but because their system is trying to create the tension level it was calibrated for. They need to generate the chaos they grew up in, because without it, they don't know how to orient themselves. Peace feels like forgetting to do something important. Harmony feels like negligence. Maybe NT's at, was I D4D's at TZ. And here's where it gets really painful. When you're operating from this place, you can't actually receive love. Someone can be pouring affection into you, and it's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The love doesn't land because you learn that approval is something you extract through performance, not something that's freely given. So when it is freely given, you don't trust it. You think they don't really see you. You think if they knew the real you, they'd withdraw the love. So you either hide harder or you test them, pushing and pushing to see when they'll finally prove that you were right to never trust this in the first place. This is the trap that keeps you hungry. Always hungry. Never fed. You're scanning every conversation for the moment it falls apart, waiting for them to leave, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And what happens? You find it. Not because it was always there, but because you went looking. You read into a delayed text. You interpret a tired tone as rejection. You turn a moment of distraction into confirmation that you're not enough. And so, the cycle feeds itself. You needed proof you matter, so you sought love. But when love arrived, you couldn't receive it, because the person offering it doesn't fit the impossible standard you're holding them to. They're not the parent who withheld. They're not the version of yourself you're trying to convince. So their love feels irrelevant. Like monopoly money. Colorful, but worthless. You wanted the trophy from the one person who'll never give it. And everyone else? They're just substitutes, placeholders. B4, B4, B4. You collect their affection like tokens, but none of it deposits into the account that actually matters to you. None of it reaches the child inside still waiting by the door. Here's what I need you to understand. That parent, that person, that version of the past you're trying to rewrite, they're not coming. The moment where they finally see you and say, "I'm sorry, you were always enough," it's not coming. And you can spend 30 more years auditioning for that role, perfecting your performance, proving your worth. And it still won't come. Reading in this, Wani, not because you failed, but because they were never capable of giving it in the first place. They were too wounded, too limited, too caught in their own survival. And that's the truth you've been running from. Because if you accept that they couldn't give it, you have to grieve. You have to feel the loss. You have to stop hoping. And hope, even painful hope, feels safer than grief. I learned this in my study of human nature. The mind will choose anxiety over emptiness every single time. Anxiety gives you something to do. It gives you a problem to solve. But grief? Grief asks you to sit still in the rubble and acknowledge that some problems can't be solved, some losses can't be recovered, some doors won't open again no matter how long you stand there knocking. When my son Francis died of smallpox at 4 years old, I didn't grieve right away. I threw myself into work. I wrote essays. I expanded my printing business. I told myself I was being productive, that I was honoring his memory by continuing forward, but I wasn't moving forward. I was running sideways. The grief was there, waiting, patient as a creditor. And when it finally caught up with me years later, it arrived not as a gentle visitor, but as a reckoning. This is what I wish I'd known then. The grief you postpone doesn't decrease, it accrues interest. Every day you spend hoping they'll change, you're delaying a payment that will only grow larger. The sooner you face what's real, the sooner you can begin building something new. Not something better, necessarily something new. A life that doesn't require their transformation to be livable. A future that doesn't hinge on their awakening. And here's the hardest truth. You can't do both. You can't fully hope and fully grieve at the same time. They're incompatible states. Hope keeps you tethered to what might be. Grief cuts the rope and lets you fall, but it's only after you fall that you discover you can build something on solid ground. So how do you actually let go? Not in theory, but in practice? You start by taking your attention off them. You stop monitoring their social media. Stop asking mutual friends for updates. Stop replaying conversations in your mind. You redirect that energy, all that precious life force you've been pouring into them, back toward yourself. You begin creating what I call memory boundaries. When a memory surfaces, and it will, you acknowledge it without diving in. You say to yourself, "That was then. This is now." You don't suppress the memory, but you also don't let it hijack your present moment. You observe it like a cloud passing overhead, rather than a storm you must enter. This requires practice. The first 100 times, you'll fail. You'll find yourself deep in a memory before you even realize what happened. That's okay. The point isn't perfection, it's redirection. Each time you catch yourself and choose to return to the present, you're building a new neural pathway. You're teaching your brain that there are other places to go besides back to them. You also start noticing the stories you've been telling yourself about the relationship. We all do this. We create narratives that explain why we can't move on. They were the one. I'll never find someone like them again. We had something special that can't be replaced. These stories feel like truth, but they're actually chains. They keep you tethered to a past that no longer serves you. What if you question those stories? What if the one is actually a limiting belief that prevents you from seeing the incredible people who might come into your life? What if never finding someone exactly like them is actually a gift, because the next person might be even better suited to who you're becoming? What if that special connection was real but not irreplaceable? I'm not asking you to diminish what you had. I'm asking you to stop using it as a reason to stay stuck. Look, I understand the fear. I really do. When you've experienced something that felt cosmically aligned, the thought of settling for anything less feels like betrayal. But here's what you're missing. That cosmic feeling? You created most of it. Not through delusion, but through presence, vulnerability, openness, and emotional risk. Those are portable skills. You brought them to that relationship, which means you can bring them to the next one. The person didn't make you capable of deep love. You were already capable. They just happened to be there when you decided to open that door. And here's the part that might sting. They've probably moved on not because they're cold or heartless, but because they understood something you're still resisting. That life continues. That grief and growth aren't mutually exclusive. That honoring what you had doesn't mean preserving it in amber and refusing to build anything new. You think you're being loyal to the memory, but what you're actually doing is using that memory as a shield against risk. Because if you never really try again, you never have to face the possibility of failure, rejection, or another loss. The ghost of your ex becomes a convenient excuse to stay protected, stay safe, stay small. I've watched people do this for decades. Turn a past relationship into a religion, build a shrine instead of a life, and then wonder why they feel so hollow, so stuck, so convinced that their best days are behind them. Your best days aren't behind you, but they will be if you keep living like they are. So here's your homework, and I'm serious about this. I want you to imagine your ex happy with someone else. Really happy, not to torture yourself, but to test something. Does that image make you feel genuinely glad for them? Or does it fill you with rage, jealousy, bitterness? Because if it's the latter, you're not grieving love, you're nursing a wound. And wounds don't heal when you keep picking at them. You see, there's a line, a very thin line between loving someone and needing them, and most of us cross it without even knowing. We confuse attachment with affection. We mistake dependence for devotion. We tell ourselves we can't live without them, when what we really mean is, we don't want to face ourselves without them. Because that's the real fear, isn't it? Not that you'll never find someone else. Not that you'll be alone forever. If you not, that's that dot. If you not, that's the real fear. But that without them, you'll have to confront the person you've been avoiding all along. Yourself. When you're in a relationship, it's easy to hide. You can distract yourself with their needs, their moods, their schedules. You can define yourself by how well you love them, how much you sacrifice, how deeply you care. But when they leave, all that noise goes silent. And suddenly, you're standing in an empty room with nothing but your own thoughts, your own flaws, your own unresolved pain. And that terrifies people more than loneliness ever could. So they cling. They check the Instagram stories. They draft texts they never send. They replay conversations, searching for hidden meanings that were never there. They construct elaborate fantasies where the person comes back, realizes their mistake, begs for forgiveness, because all of that, painful as it is, feels safer than sitting with the silence and asking, asterisk, who am I without them? What parts of myself did I lose? What wounds was I using this relationship to avoid? Asterisk. Here's the brutal truth. No one can complete you. That's not romance, that's a business transaction. You're not two halves making a whole. You're not two halves making a whole. You're two whole people choosing to walk the same path. And when someone leaves, they don't take half of you with them. They just reveal the half you never properly built. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Franklin, this all sounds very reasonable when you're sitting there calm writing about it. But what about when you're actually in it? What about when every song reminds you of them? When you see someone who looks like them from behind and your heart stops? When you wake up at 3 a.m. and reach for a phone that should stay dark? And you're right. Knowledge doesn't prevent pain. Understanding the mathematics of heartbreak doesn't make the heartbreak hurt less. I've stood at my window at dawn, sleepless, watching Philadelphia wake up, feeling like I was the only person in the world who understood true loneliness. And I assure you, knowing it was temporary didn't make that moment less real. But here's what that knowledge did do. It kept me from making permanent decisions based on temporary feelings. It kept me from sending letters I'd have regretted, From showing up places I shouldn't be, from making grand gestures that were really just elaborate forms of begging, from burning bridges in anger or building shrines in desperation. The pain demands to be felt, yes, but it doesn't get to make your decisions. There's this peculiar phenomenon I've observed. The intensity of missing someone is not actually proportional to how good they were for you. I've seen people devastated over relationships that were obviously terrible. I've watched friends pine for someone who treated them poorly, while barely thinking about someone who treated them well. Why? Because we don't miss people. We miss feelings. We miss versions of ourselves. We miss potential and promises, and the future we'd constructed in our imagination. We miss the person we thought they were becoming, not the person they actually were. And that future you're grieving? It never existed. You're mourning a ghost. This is perhaps the cruelest trick of heartbreak, that we suffer over something that was never real to begin with. But it's also, paradoxically, the key to freedom. Because if you're crying over something imaginary, you can also imagine something better. The imagination that created your prison can also build your palace. The same mind that convinced you that you'd found the one can convince you that you're capable of genuine love, not the obsessive, anxious attachment you mistook for it, but real love, which begins with loving yourself enough to walk away from people who don't choose you. I learned this the hard way, naturally. After my own devastation, I spent months analyzing what had happened. I journaled obsessively. I talked to friends until they were sick of hearing about it. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Every relationship I'd idealized had one thing in common: ambiguity. The ones who were clear about wanting me, I found reasons to be lukewarm. But the ones who were unclear, inconsistent, hot and cold, those were the ones I convinced myself were special. Thank you for watching, and dead end. And if you looking out experience 1/21. It wasn't about them at all. It was about me, trying to resolve an old wound by finally getting the ambivalent person to choose me fully. Classic anxious attachment meets avoidant attachment, as the therapists say, a recipe for suffering disguised as romance. Here's what nobody tells you. The pain of heartbreak isn't proportional to how good the relationship was. It's proportional to how much of yourself you abandon to maintain it. That's why the worst heartbreaks often come from mediocre relationships. Because you didn't just lose a person, you lost your self-respect, your boundaries, your inner voice that knew better all along. The path forward isn't about getting over them. It's about getting back to you. The version of you that existed before you contorted yourself into someone worthy of their inconsistent affection. That person is still there, waiting patiently beneath all the stories you've told yourself. And here's the beautiful thing. Once you find that person again, you'll look back and wonder what you ever saw in someone who couldn't see your worth. Not because you're bitter, but because you'll finally see yourself clearly.